Hello everyone, welcome to this ASNC Society lecture. We have Kate Russell speaking today from the group that created this, the Alderney Bayeux Tapestry Finale, and she's going to talk to us with the title 1066 and how history was stitched up. I should really have read this beforehand, but I didn't. Well, no, I did, but not in the last 5 minutes beforehand. So yes, thank you very much for coming, and I hope you enjoyed. Do you need help with?
Well, let's begin with another problem. It says you can't find the PowerPoint. Okay. My bet is that everybody in this room has already heard that the Bayeux Tapestry is coming to England. This is where it was made. Just about everybody agrees that that's the case. If I say just about everybody, it's because just about everything I say can be disputed by somebody. So the general opinion is that it was made here in England. We don't know when it went to Bayeux. We don't know how it went to Bayeux, but the French have been quite reluctant to share it. It's my personal opinion that this is not necessarily an act of generosity on the part of Monsieur Macron. The building it has been housed in is crumbling. And I think he just needs to do something with the tapestry while they fix the building. So it's not to say that we aren't appreciative, but there is a little background history to that. So that's probably what's going on. Whatever the case, I don't think they have yet announced where it's going to go. Our fondest hope is that when they find a venue, they will decide that the end of it ought to be there. Because another of the things that's generally assumed is that there was a missing 8 to 10 feet of the tapestry, or 3 meters if we have to speak in modern tongue. But this was the brief that Pauline had. This is Pauline Black, who designed this little miracle. And she was told what the history was and given carte blanche to put anything she felt was appropriate, so long as we had William on the throne at the end. Because the Bayeux Tapestry would have been designed with, or in fact was designed with Edward at the very beginning. Somewhere in the middle, Harold is on the throne. So surely, since this is supposed to be celebrating the victory of William, it would have had to end with William. So we definitely have William on the throne. But I think we ought to back up. Is this working?
It's the other one. It's the black one.
No,
It's the black
okay.
one.
The black one. Okay.
I don't know whether it will do that. I think it might be only connected to that computer, so you may just have to press the arrows on mine.
Okay, we'll press the arrows. Okay. What was going on in Europe at the time? We have to really rush through everything until we get to telling you about this, because we're going to run out of time. But just as a reminder of what was going on in Europe, Europe was not then what it is now, by any means. And there were huge changes going on that would eventually affect everyone, especially the changes with the church. I mean, you had the Great Schism that was occurring when Rome and Byzantine separated. It didn't affect the ordinary people for a long time, but it was happening, and it was eventually going to tear that unity of Christianity apart. That was an important thing. They also began the development of the heavy plow, which meant you could effectively plow and the heavy soils of Northern Europe, so you could increase the yields of your crops. If you increase the yields of the crops, you could increase the population. So there was a huge population explosion going on in Northern Europe, and that always has consequences, as we know today. You had Muslims coming in through the east and up from the south, and all of this was threatening the Christian unity of Europe. So these are major stresses going on in the lives of Europeans at the time. And then you have England in the 11th century. They had the history of Viking raids when Ethelred was taking huge quantities of the English silver pennies that were so prized and paying them to the Vikings. England was conquered by the Danes in 1016 and was ruled by Canute the Great until 1035. It was a relatively peaceful reign once he was settled on the throne, but there's still a lot of upheaval. tremendous upheaval in the aristocracy, or at least the top level of the aristocracy. After he died, there were royal succession disputes, a near civil war going on. This is obviously disruptive. After 1042, when Edward the Conqueror came onto the throne, England settled down into a long period of stability. Stability equals economic growth, and England became the richest country in Western Europe, and obviously therefore a rich prize once Edward died. In 1065, we had near civil war with the two Godwin brothers, who were the most powerful earls in England, at loggerheads. We don't have time to go into that history, but it was nearly a civil war again. And this was a great stress and strain in England. It probably is what cost Harold the Battle of Hastings, because he lost a lot of people who were following Tosti. He also, well, I'm not going to take the time to tell you all this. We have too little time altogether. We have the death of Edward in January of 1066. He has no designated heir. There are 4 contenders for the throne. Obviously, there is Harold Godwin's son, the strongest earl in England, nearly as rich as the king. The man that himself has been nearly ruling England. Edward is still the king, but he's powerless. Harold is the real ruler of England, and he's done a very competent job, and the people are very happy with him. But he has no royal blood. We have Duke William, Duke of Normandy. He is the great nephew of the mother of Edward the Confessor. So there is a blood tie between them, but it's very loose. But William believes that Edward has promised him the throne, and he convinces a lot of other people that that's the case. Whether it really happened or not is another of those historical mysteries. You can take your pick according to the source, but we don't know if it happened, but we can pretty well surmise that William believed it happened. Svein Estridsson was the king of Denmark. He was the nephew of King Knut. He also believed he had a right to the English throne. He thought Edward was just a caretaker because the throne should have passed through the Danish royal family. At the time, he was involved in a fight with the King of Norway, so he wasn't in a position to make a claim, but he felt very strongly that he had the right to the throne. King Harald Hardrada was the Norwegian who also believed that he had a right to the throne because of a promise made to one of Knut's sons that whoever died first, either Magnus of Norway or Harald Knut, would cede his power to the other over the relevant kingdoms. Unfortunately, Magnus had died and Hardrada took over in Norway, so he just assumed that he would be the one to inherit. All of this is going to lead to problems. Okay. So then, what is the condition of England as opposed to Normandy? Because Svein Estridsson and Harald Hardrada are not threats at this point. They're contenders, and they are assumed to be potential problems, but the real difficulty is going to come between Harold in England and William in Normandy. England has been stable since the 5th century. Yes, there were disputes. Yes, it was a violent age. But on the whole, England had a stable government. It had a unified government. It was well governed and it was rich. Again, richest country in Western Europe. Their religion came from both the Celtic roots and the Roman roots. And this would lead to difficulties of interpretation of how things should have been done within the church from time to time. It certainly led William to believe that the English church needed to be reformed. They were relatively peaceful, again, a violent age, but relatively peaceful. They believed in settling disputes by talking them through rather than reaching for their swords, on the whole. And they were law-abiding in an age when not many people were. So if the government decreed, for example, that a geld should be raised, a tax to pay the Vikings, they could do it in England because the people believed that they had an allegiance to their government. They were highly developed in the arts and literature of the age, and they reached far and wide to learn new ideas from other cultures, extremely important arts and literature. In comparison, in Normandy, it's only settled by Vikings in 9/11. It was extremely unstable when William was a youth. He became the Duke when he was only about 7 or 8 years old, and there were his uncles fighting for the control of this man and therefore Normandy. When he became mature, he began to get a grip on Normandy, and it was a strong grip, but he had dangerous enemies around. The Count of Anjou and the King of France were bitter enemies of William's, and it was only when they died in 1060 that he was free to look elsewhere for what he might do in the way of expanding Normandy. The Normans were people who were violent, and they kept expanding. Each new duke was building onto the dukedom of Normandy. William felt the same. They were competitive, aggressive, expansive, and they were very advanced in warfare. They developed the cavalry charge, the cavalry, cavalry being used in warfare. And they bred special horses, the destriers, to be their cavalry horses. Very special, very heavy horses, and able to withstand the shocks of warfare. So this was quite a threat. And they were the architects of the age. Okay, how did you choose an English king? 4 things were important. Royal blood. Normally the choice was only amongst people who were sons of a monarch who had reigned. He didn't have to be the reigning monarch, but he had to have royal blood. He had, ideally, he would be chosen by the previous monarch. The thing that was really critical, though, was his ability to defend the kingdom. There was somebody who could have inherited from Edward the Confessor, but he was only a boy of maybe 12 to 14 years of age. He had no people who were committed to him that he could call up as his personal troops. He had no ability to defend the kingdom. So when the choice came, the Witan, the Council of Nobles and Clergy, unanimously chose Harold as the next king. They had overlooked the blood tie because that was much less important than the ability to defend the kingdom. Okay, how a Norman duke was chosen? Only the choice of the previous duke. There was no proto-democracy going on in Normandy. Everything depended on who the previous duke had chosen. And that was going to lead to a problem, because William believed that he should be the king, because he said, Edward promised it to me. By Norman rules, that would have been enough. Harold believed he should be the king because the Witan chose him. Obviously, conflict. 2 indisputable facts only. It was fought in October of 1066. The calendar changed after that. So although the date of the Battle of Hastings is the 14th of October, that really is closer to the 26th of October in our terms. When Harold stood down his beard on the 8th of September, because he thought William would never come across the sea in the weather he would have then, it's because that would have been the season of the equinoctial gales. So October 1066. The other one, William won. Everything else is open to debate. And so everything I have to tell you from now on, you can discount if you like. Okay, so the Bayeux Tapestry. What is it and why is it important? It contains the only images we have, the only contemporary images of what happened before and at the Battle of Hastings. It's wool. The wool is the same as the wool we have here. It's 55 to 60 count linen. Sorry, the wool, when I say that, the fabric is linen. It is stitched with wool. There is one place on the Bayeux Tapestry where it is stitched in linen, and nobody knows why. Everything else is wool. It is simple embroidery, very simple embroidery. If we do have a chance to go through that little slideshow, you'll see we have a lot of children stitching. And this afternoon, we went to the Fitzwilliam Museum and saw some exquisite embroidery. The English were the Europe's best embroiderers of that age. They were well known for it. The stuff they could do was wonderful. This is simple. It could have been done just as we did it with any number of people who were not necessarily skilled in embroidery. So when you think of the Bayeux Tapestry and where it was made, yes, it was probably made in England, but it was not necessarily made by skilled embroiderers. Okay. So then how is it designed? This is an image from ours, just because it's easier to show you. What is written in here, or stitched in here, is intended to be the historical record of what happened. The things that are in the borders give you supplemental information or make comments on this. It is felt that the borders were left up to the embroiderers to design to quite an extent. But I'm not so sure. You have two professors here who've done a lot more study on the borders of the tapestry, and they can tell you quite a bit more than I could about the fables that are in the tapestry. And I think they are discovering now that more and more images that were just puzzles before are actually more fables. Fables were used as a method of instruction at that time. And so to put fables into the Bayeux Tapestry is giving people a reason to say, ah, well, the moral of that one is this, and so that means that in the main section of the tapestry. Okay. Now we have to go through this really quickly, and I apologize. The tapestry opens with Edward on the throne, and you can see they have fingers touching. That indicates that some extremely important message or command is being transmitted. We have no idea what it is because the caption only says Edward the King. He is talking to Harold, but to what purpose, we will never know. If you go to Normandy and you see the Bayeux Tapestry there, and you listen to what they say about it, they will say, here Edward is sending Harold to tell William that William is to be the next king. I don't think anybody who really examines the situation would believe that that is what would happen. And whoever designed the tapestry is also saying it ain't necessarily so. But something important is going on. Okay, then Harold and his mates, oops, I beg your pardon, are shown with a hawk, the hunting dogs. Whatever their mission is going to be, it is peaceful. Then they go to pray and to feast in Bosom. Now the prayer could have been because they were about to go to sea, and going to sea in that age, of course, would be dangerous. So possibly a sea voyage was intended. And the next slide would make you think, yes, that is so. They go out to sea, and there is a storm. So they're blown off course from wherever they were going, but we'll never know where they were going. Now, one of the anomalies in the tapestry is, if you look at this sail, they were trying to show the square sails of the Vikings. And in 99% of the tapestry, you see the sail comes down to a point. And here, obviously that had been drawn in, but the embroiderers were thinking, but that's not what a sail looks like. So we have these odd lines in there because there's a bit of confusion about how they should have done it. As soon as they get to the area around Ponthieu, they are shipwrecked. And Harold is now being shown here, being captured, and he will be taken to Guy of Ponthieu, who is a well-known ransomer of shipwrecked sailors. And he knows now he's got the richest prize in England. He's got Harold. He will then, there's a bit of confusion in the scenes that probably indicates he wanted to hang on to him for the ransom. William said, you are my vassal, Harold is your prisoner, you gave him to me, you must do this because you have to do as I say. So Guy does take Harold to meet William. Then, immediately after that scene, comes the biggest mystery in the tapestry, and that is this lady. There are only 3 ladies in all of the Bayeux Tapestry, and she is the only one who is given a name. And the problem is that that name was as common as Mary would have been in, say, France. There are too many Elfgivas, and we don't know who she is. When Edward the Confessor's mother, Emma, was married to Ethelred, she had to take an English name, Elfgiva. The first wife of Ethelred was Elfgiva. After Ethelred died, she married Canute. And Canute had a handfast Danish marriage wife, whose name was Elfgiva. There is also an abbess who was being given attentions by William's half-brother, and her name was Elfgiva. And so it goes. There are too many Elfgivas for you to know who this is. All you can know is the people who saw this when it was done would have known who she was, and there was probably some scandal involved. And one of the reasons for thinking this is that this man is being mirrored down here. And so the implication is there is a sexual connection. That's the most common way that is seen. Now your two professors have an idea that this is another myth, another fable, that this is the mountain giving birth to a mouse, or the man giving birth to a mouse. If so, I'm not sure what they're trying to say about what's in the main section, but they can probably explain it better. Another idea is that Odo, William's half-brother, having had a wicked affair with this Elfgiva, the abbess, obviously being shown by this man, would suffer the punishment William later decreed for people who committed adultery, which was castration. It didn't happen to Odo, but maybe that is trying to make you remember that that's one of William's punishments. We don't know. But if any of you would like to do some research, there's a topic that will keep people going for a long time. Okay, then a fair section of the tapestry concerns a campaign that William went on into Brittany. Why did they put it in the tapestry? It doesn't have anything to do with the Battle of Hastings. So that is another question that we have. Immediately after that, you see the most important scene in the tapestry, as far as, in my opinion, where Harold is swearing an oath on reliquaries. This is shown as happening immediately after the trip to Brittany. The Norman sources say it happened before. So there's another question. Why is it shown afterwards in the tapestry? But if you notice, Harold is not exactly grasping the reliquaries and saying, I swear, whatever it is that he swears. He's doing it because he has to. William, with his sword in his hand, to my mind, represents duress for Harold. And that of itself would, in theory, make any oath he swore null and void. The Norman sources say at this point he swore Harold would promote William as the next king of England. He would fortify Dover and give it to him. That he would allow one of William's knights to marry his sister, his daughter, and that he might marry, I think it was a sister of William's. No, he didn't have a sister. Anyway, a high-ranking Norman woman, so that there would be a nice close tie, and then he and Harold could rule England happily forever after. Harold was not necessarily going to go along with that, as we shall see. Now, what was the purpose of Harold's mission to go to Normandy? The English say, and there is only one English chronicler who has really written about, and he wrote about it, I think it was late in the 11th century, possibly beginning of the 12th century, and he said Harold went to see William to try to get his brother and his nephew back to England. They were hostages of William's. And you can tell that this is an Englishman because he has a full head of hair and a beard. Harold has a mustache and a full head of hair. The Normans have shaved the backs of their heads. So at least in this part of the tapestry, you can tell who is who. But if that's the case, then the mission had nothing to do with telling William that he was to be the next king. Okay. Whoops. We are missing a slide. Yes, the Norman version about his becoming the king. Right. So once the oath has been sworn, then Harold is free to leave. And you can see how closely these occur, because here is the oath. This fellow is just about ready to jump on board the ship. And they go back to England, where, they go to see King Edward, And everything about Harold's posture here says, I have created a terrible mess. It has been a disaster. Everything has gone wrong. If Edward sent Harold to say to William, you should be the next king, then he would have succeeded. Why this look of chagrin? Why this apologetic posture? It seems to me that at this point in the tapestry, they are favoring the English version. Then we come to a very confusing scene. First, we show Edward's funeral. The scene following that is his deathbed. There are two possibilities, because I don't think the English were burying people alive at that point. But if the cartoons on which the tapestry had been designed were reversed and it was put onto the linen, there would be nothing you could do about it. You'd have to stitch it as it was. That's one explanation. Another is, here you have these people representing the Witan pointing to the live Edward and saying, Edward chose you to be king. And if you notice, we have another sacred oath, sacred command going on, because Harold and Edward are again touching fingers. It is said on his deathbed that Edward gave the protection of the kingdom and of his queen, who was Harold's sister, to Harold. He didn't actually say he gave him the kingship, but he gave him the protection of the kingdom. And as far as the Witan was concerned, that was good enough, and so they did choose Harold. So, the next day, he's crowned. And here you do have a lot of spin, because they are showing Stigand, who is the Archbishop of Canterbury. Stigand was not recognized by the Pope. In fact, he was excommunicated. Harold was too savvy to have had Stigand doing the crowning. That would have made it null and void in the eyes of the church. So I feel quite sure he was crowned by Aldred of York. And most of the sources will tell you that that is the way it should be read now. But we can't prove it. So there sits Harold on his throne. And just after that, we see an English ship going over to Normandy. And if you look at the fellow up in the border, you say, oh no. And in that case, what it is William has some spies. His spies have now gone over, and they're going to tell William Harold has just been crowned. This sets William into a rage. He was out hunting at the time, and he didn't say a thing. He stopped, turned around, went back to his palace, and just sat for 2 hours without saying anything because he was so angry. After that, he began immediately making his preparations, and his preparations were excellent. He basically used diplomatic skills to convince the rulers of Northern Europe that he was the one who should have been the rightful king and that Harold had committed perjury. This increased his support for the attack army. All of that, by the way, January, now we have Halleys Comet at the end of April. You always get the sense Harold became the king and the comet appeared. No, there were 3 months in between. And all that we know of Harold's reign is that it was good, that it was peaceable, that the people were happy. But the comet is going to set them into quite a whirl, because comets meant disaster was coming. And the comet was much, much brighter then because it passed so much closer to the Earth. So this would have worried the people. Back in Normandy, they're building a navy. And what this scene is telling us is the Vikings who settled Norway, having been warriors who were at sea, have had their traditions lost. The Normans are now farmers, they're settled people, and they have to use old men to build their ships because the younger men don't know how to do it anymore. The tools that they're using, shown here, are the only images that we have from that period of what the tools used in building a ship would have been. You can see some of them in Reading Museum, where they have a copy of the Bayeux Tapestry, and they do have some of these tools that have been unearthed. But it was the Bayeux Tapestry that gave people the idea of what they looked like. Then they load the ships, and I love this because you can tell that the Normans have already become French because they are loading the arms they need and they're loading wine. But they don't have any other provisions that they're particularly showing. I mean, the coats of mail, obviously, but you know, where's the bread? Where's the meat? Well, they'll get all these things when they get to England. But you notice it's taking 2 men to carry a coat of mail. These things were heavy. Okay. William's ship, the Mora, this was a gift of his wife. Some people say this represents a papal banner. I don't personally think that it would, because I think if he had a papal banner, he wouldn't fly it from the top of his ship where it could be torn in the wind. But he says that he received a papal banner, meaning the Pope blessed his conquest in England. Again, we can't know, but we do have an assurance from Gregory VII that, yes, the Pope did say, William, you have my blessing now. And then they land. And here again, the border is giving you some idea of what's going on, because here you have these birds all aflutter, because there's a lot of commotion. This could also represent the panic that the English were going to feel when they realized what had just happened. And again, wyverns in the lower border spitting fire. This is a portent of disaster ahead. As far as the unloading of the horses are concerned, this is obviously showing that the person who designed this didn't have any idea about how to unload a ship, because you couldn't have unloaded 2 horses simultaneously from a ship. Now, as far as the food and drink are concerned, well, not the drink, but the food is concerned, they found it by harrying the land where they landed. They landed in Pevensey, they moved on to Hastings, and they destroyed the surrounding area to get all the provisions that they required. The woman in this scene is wearing aristocratic dress. It is, some people believe that this represents Edith Swanneck, Harold's handfast wife, the love of his life, and possibly his young son, Ulf, who is going to become a hostage of William's. She may just represent, you know, all women. He may represent all children. But this is now the second woman in the main part of the tapestry. Oh no, I beg your pardon. She's the third, because we forgot about Edward's wife at his deathbed. My apologies. This is one of the scenes that is, as much as we can say, a proof that this was designed in Canterbury. This little character down here is a direct copy from a Psalter in Canterbury. And it could not have been a Norman design without Normans having been at Canterbury. So we can pretty safely say whoever was behind this was in Canterbury. We have Odo, William's half-brother again, who is the Bishop of Bayeux. He's sitting at the head of the table as though he is Jesus. You will see him being promoted throughout the tapestry in a way that never existed in life. And the question is, why? Most of the books you see are going to say Odo was the patron of Bayeux Tapestry. There are other contenders. The battle begins at 9 in the morning, and it will go on for between 8 and 9 hours. Depends on how you see it, because later on I'm going to tell you it stops at 3:30. It was essentially a shield wall on the part of the English at the top of a hill, steep hill, with a marshy area below. Terrible for cavalry. William has infantry, he has mailed infantry, the archers, and he has his cavalry. The cavalry cannot get through a shield wall until it is broken. So as long as the shield wall holds, Harold will be safe. The problem is that it didn't always hold, and eventually the cavalry got in. At that point, they can cause mayhem. But it represents the last major battle where a shield wall was used. And then we get to the death of Harold. it doesn't matter how many times people have heard me say, we don't know how he died. They'll all go back and say, yeah, he was shot in the eye with an arrow. This is a myth that has now taken on a life of its own. There is no proof of how Harold died. There isn't even proof that he died. There is a Norse saga that says that he was wounded, carried off the field. And after he recovered, he went off to live as a hermit for 3 years. I don't believe a man of Harold's character would have done that. So I'm afraid I believe he was killed. How he was killed, we don't know, because no one who wrote about the Battle of Hastings was there. So we can only say he died. Then you have House Carl loyalty. The House Carls were his household troops, and they were specially trained. All they did was protect the king. And by the code that they lived by, they would die in the place where their lord was slain. They would not say, come on, let's go back and reorganize and we'll come back and fight for another day. This was important to them. They would lose honor if they did not carry on the fight their lord had made. It may seem strange to us, but if it's their belief, it's their way, we should allow them at least a lack of condemnation for having chosen that way. Okay, and then the end of the Bayeux Tapestry. It is an absurd end. In the first place, the style of it is entirely different from the rest of the tapestry. This was all heavily reconstructed back in Victorian times. And it ends with the English being chased off the field. That is an anticlimax. It surely had to have another ending. And so, I'm sorry about my squeaky shoes. They know that on the night of the battle, William dined on the battlefield. He erected his tent and he spent the night there. That was the way you demonstrated that you had won the battle. You possessed the field. We know that he drank champagne. So we showed him with champagne. It had no bubbles in it yet because Veuve Clicquot, who was the one who first introduced the bubbles, had not yet come to life. But we show them eating fish and bread. Christian images, because they sold the idea that they should conquer England as well, because they were going to reform the English church. You know, it had these strange Celtic ways that had to be cleansed. So this is all part of the imagery that Pauline has put into this. This banner represents Harold's personal banner, his fighting man. Nobody knows what it looked like other than that it showed a fighting man and that it was embroidered with gold and precious jewels. Well, the precious jewels of the time would have been rubies. If we made the banner red, we couldn't have rubies on there. But the banner was sent after the battle to the Pope to thank him for his support. After that, it disappeared. Probably because it was embroidered in gold and with precious jewels. These things would be recycled if you could get away with it. So the banner has totally disappeared. I had a conference with the Lancaster Herald of the College of Arms, who said he'd been searching for it for 6 months, trying to find out what did this banner look like. And there is no trace of it. This represents the wyvern, the symbol of the House of Wessex, which became the ruling house of England. And both banners were trampled under feet by Harold and his people after the battle. So we show them there. The following day, the Anglo-Saxon women were allowed to come in and claim their dead. The Normans only buried Normans, the Bretons only buried Bretons, and so on. And there was nobody there to bury the English. So if the women came, they could collect the bodies of their people and take them home. It is known that Harold was so unrecognizable, if he was killed that way, that Edith Swanneck recognized him by marks known only to her, which I think is lovely and poetic, probably broke her heart. But we've tried to show women who would be in a state of distress over their men. Down here, you see the collecting of weapons because they would have been incredibly valuable, and some of the beasts of the battle, as they're known. These would have been the creatures that came in and cleaned up the bodies that got left behind. In scene 2, we've moved on from the 14th of October to early December, William waited at Hastings, expecting the submission of the English, which never came. The English had gone to London, and they had chosen Edgar the Atheling, this little fellow, again, the 12 to 14-year-old, who did have royal blood. He was all that was left to them as a choice for king. Not very powerful, but they wanted him. They did not want a foreign king. So having waited at Hastings, William then said, okay, and he moved on to Romney. 2 of his ships had gone into Romney, and the crews had been slaughtered. So he destroyed Romney and slaughtered the inhabitants. The word of this got to Dover. So when William got to Dover, instead of closing the gates, Dover was a fortified city, but they put up no resistance. They opened the gates and submitted to William, lest the same thing happened to them that had happened in Romney. Then William went on to Canterbury. At Canterbury, the same thing happened. The gates opened, the town submitted. But here, dysentery was catching up with them, and William got a good case of it. They thought he would die. It took him about a month to recover from this, and while he was recovering, he sent about 500 troops to take London. London resisted, and as a result, these poor 500, or those that were left, had to come back, probably tails between their legs, and say, William, we didn't do it. And at this point, William took charge again and said, bother London. He went west, and he cut a swathe through England, about 20 miles wide, destroying everything. And he circled around, crossing the Thames at Wallingford, until he came down to Berkhamsted. At Berkhamsted, the nobles who were in London knew they could not resist any longer. They couldn't get any resupplies, they couldn't get any reinforcements. They had no choice but to accept William's kingship. So it is here that they surrender. Now, at this point, we have 2 wyverns in the bottom border, and they really are commenting on what's going on, because these wyverns have different tongues. They represent the different languages that would have been spoken by the Normans and the Anglo-Saxons, but they also represent the difference in what is understood by submitting to your lord. As far as the English were concerned, okay, they're going to have a change of king. They wanted their own, but they're now going to have a Norman king. But other than that, they expect that life will carry on as it was, because they pledged themselves to a lord in exchange for the lord's protection. So now they are just asking William for his protection, and if he will give it, they'll be good little citizens. As far as the Normans are concerned, and especially William, all England now belongs to him, and he can do with it as he chooses. He tries to go about it in a way that will make people feel he's obeying the laws of England, but in the end, the roots of the revolts that he's going to have for a good part of his reign are right here because of this difference in what's going on with the understanding of submission. It's quite tragic for the English, because they really have no idea the powers William will take upon himself. He begins by declaring that anyone who fought at Hastings was a traitor to him, because he should have been king. The forfeit for a traitor was that he had to surrender his lands to the king. Of course, a lot of people have died, and so their land is now in jeopardy. He institutes taxes, which are going to bankrupt some of them, so they end up having to give him their land. It is cataclysmic for the Anglo-Saxons. It's not at this point, but by the time he finishes his reign, 21 years later, only 8% of English land is held in English hands. There are no English earls. There are no English bishops. He has completely taken over the whole ruling class of England, and all the ways are going to become increasingly Norman, but using the English substructure of this very effective government to make sure that he can enforce his laws. Here in the surrender party, you have the 2 northern earls, Edwin and Morcar, who didn't get to Hastings in time. There are people who say they really didn't support Harold's kingship, and they dragged their feet getting to Hastings. They had the Battle of Fulford on the 20th of September and lost vast numbers of men. They'd had the Battle of Stamford Bridge, again, huge slaughter. They then had to come south with what they had left of troops And they actually got to London by the time of the Battle of Hastings, but they couldn't get to Hastings in time to help out Harold. I'm not sure that they were traitors. We also show here the Archbishop of York, who was also part of the surrender party. They knew they were finished. They were going to have to accept William. But the way they said it was, in effect, William, we asked you to be our king because we are used to being ruled by a king and we would like you to take the job. So it all sounds very peaceable at this point. And the scene down here is a hunting scene because the pastime of the aristocracy when they weren't bashing at each other was hunting. They spent most of their time hunting. And this is to demonstrate that William expects to have a peaceful reign. Then we come to the coronation scene. Buildings and trees in the Bayeux Tapestry represent a change of scene. And here we are on Christmas Day, where they give William the crown of the kingdom. Archbishop Aldred of York doing the crowning, so we've got that cleaned up, no more Stegon. We have two Normans here, and I'm afraid we should have asked Cambridge, but we had a tame member of Oxford College, Oxford University, who could help us with anything we needed to research. And so we said, would the Normans who went in with William for his crowning at Westminster Abbey, would they have been wearing mail? Would they have been armed? And they did some research for a while, and they came back and said, we don't know. So instead we've compromised. We've shown them with weapons, but not with chainmail. We just don't know. But here's William receiving his crown. He is using Geoffrey of Coutances, the Bishop of Coutances, as an interpreter because William can't speak English. Geoffrey could. And Aldred asked the congregation, as is still part of the coronation ceremony, will you have this person to be your monarch? And the Anglo-Saxons shouted out, yes. But curiously, it wasn't in Norman French. And the Normans thought this was a cry of rebellion. So there is a little pandemonium in the abbey as the Normans get excited and the Anglo-Saxons don't understand. And with all that commotion, the Normans outside set fire to the surrounding houses, probably in that good old soldierly way of a bit of rape and pillage. But the fire that they start sends smoke back into the abbey, and the congregation flees. So as William's getting his crown, I'm afraid there is chaos in the abbey, and there isn't the audience that he would like to have. We've shown him being approved of by the three estates of society: those who pray, those who fight, and those who work. Because at that point, they had accepted what had to be. At the end, we've shown the Tower of London. Now here, we suffered from the same fate as was possible for that transposition of Edward's funeral and his deathbed. Because I had understood that William had already started construction of the Tower of London by the time of his coronation. So we drew it in, because it was through his fortifications that he conquered the English. The fortifications he built could be used both for offensive purposes and defensive. The Old English burhs were only good for defensive purposes. So what the Normans introduced was an entirely different way of warfare, and they could protect themselves at the same time that they were attacking the Anglo-Saxons. So it was really the fortifications that caused the complete Norman conquest. Well, as this was all traced out onto our linen, I read, no. He built a Mont and Bailey fort on the site that would become the Tower of London. But the Tower of London couldn't be begun until 1075. Well, we were stuck. So instead of coloring it in, we have ghostly outlines to show that that is what was coming. That is the way of the future. Up in the top border, you see white stone being shipped over. They brought the white stone from Caen to build the Tower of London. There are several other buildings in England that are using this white stone. It was very special to the Normans, and so yes, they used it. In the bottom border here, we have one of my favorite logos because it represents the Channel Islands. This was Pauline's design. I think she's a genius. The Channel Islands were known by little nicknames from as far back as we could trace. In Guernsey, they're known as donkeys. In Jersey, they're known as toads. And we didn't know what Alderney was, because Alderney didn't figure. We were only little. And so we asked everybody who was from an old Alderney family, what's the Alderney animal? I don't know. I guess it's a puffin. And this happened for every single person until Widget Finn, in the Green, wrote an article that was published in the Telegraph about this, at which point everybody with an Alderney family said, no, it's not a puffin, it's a... And then they gave us a choice of several. So as far as we were concerned, it's a puffin. It's now a puffin with the tail of the lion, the English lion, encircling them, because this is the point at which the Channel Islands became English. And we're very happy about that. We concluded this here with a phrase which is the last line of one of the Anglo-Saxon chronicles for 1066. And here I would love the Anglo-Saxon scholars to correct my pronunciation, because I've been saying it this way for a long time. Vulle godse ende dana god wille. I've seen it translated a couple of ways. The end will be good as God wills, or when God wills, the end will be good. But the Bayeux Tapestry is full of enigmatic writings. You know, as we said, Edward Rex, not Edward Rex sends Herald to tell William blah, blah, blah. Or not, Harold swears an oath to William that. It's just, he swears an oath. And Elgiva with the cleric, where a certain cleric and Elgiva, and we don't know what they're doing. If only we had a verb, you know, but we're missing these things. In the same way, if you were a Norman, you would take from this, God has willed it, that is why we won. Because the English were sinful people and they've been punished. If you were English, you could say, stand by, all will be well in the end. We're going through a bad patch now, but God is on our side because God has always been an Englishman, right? You can take the meaning as you like, but we thought it would be perfect to sit between the turrets of the Tower of London. And in the bottom here, we have our embroideresses. They never get credit for what they did, and I think it's overdue. Oh, I'm going to show you this on the side so that you can see it better. There. We've also concluded this because remember, above all, these were God-fearing people. They didn't have all the development science has taught us so that we can say, oh, you got flu because you were with somebody who had flu. You got flu because God willed it in those days. And here, we have the hand of God, just as you have it above Westminster Abbey in the tapestry. You have this phrase indicating that God is a force who rules on earth. And our embroiderers with their frame, the Alpha and the Omega, this symbol representing God. So I hope that you would agree that that is an appropriate ending for this. Well, I'll tell you about that in a minute. But anyway, there are new possibilities. And this is, again, where your two professors were very much involved in a book that I've just read about where the tapestry was designed, why it came about. There are people who, I've mentioned that the designer had to have been a monk from St. Augustine's. That's pretty well established. The embroiderers, who knows? But it is felt that it would have been done in the nunneries. There were a lot of lay women whose husbands had been killed husbands or fathers been killed at Hastings, and they went to the nunneries for protection. So you would have a lot of talent available who could have done this. As for the patron, there are several candidates. I mentioned that Odo is the considered patron in the eyes of most of the authors of books you will read. There is that because his role is seen as so much more important than it would have been. Carola Hicks wrote a beautiful biography of the Bayeux Tapestry, which I would recommend to everybody. She thinks it might have been Edith, Harold's sister, Edward's wife. and she was a very skilled embroideress. And she also was an extremely knowledgeable woman who had just lost 4 of her brothers in 3 weeks. So she might have had a reason to try to show that they actually deserved a place in history. We can't know. Eustace was Eustace of Boulogne, and he shows up in the Bayeux Tapestry at the point at which William is shown lifting his helmet to say, "I'm not dead. Come on, guys, let's get back into the fray." Eustace was descended on both his mother's and father's sides from Charlemagne. He also had a good claim to the English throne, but he wasn't a strong enough person to push it forward. But if he was the one who commissioned this, it's because he also elevated his role during the Battle of Hastings. But the new thinking is that it was probably Abbot Skoland or Scotland, who is shown here. You know that's an abbot because only abbots, dukes, and kings sat on benches that had armrests. Everybody else had just a plain bench. So we know that he's the abbot. That's an image of Mont Saint-Michel, and it is the only place in the tapestry, right here, where there is embroidery that covers embroidery. Everywhere else, it's just plain embroidery. It was obviously designed that way in the first place. Here, it's an afterthought. And so the question would be, why? Why did they do it that way? And possibly because somebody said, well, hang on, if he's the man who is the patron, we'd better put something that represents him into this tapestry. Okay, there's a scene here, early on in the tapestry, where Harold is shown, this is Harold, and he's shown pulling 2 Normans out of quicksand. This is during the campaign in Brittany. In Anglo-Saxon tapestries, you told the story of the hero. You never made his opponent equally a hero. You had one hero. So in this case, if this is a tapestry celebrating William, why is Harold shown doing something heroic? And the new thinking is that it was the monks at St. Augustine's, who were both Norman and Anglo-Saxon, learning to work together and deciding to create something that would give an atmosphere of peace between them. But even more so, with the fables that are in there, the message is, does it really matter who the king is? It's all going to be the same. The kings rule, but our life will continue. These are men of the church. They are not as affected by what's happening according to the kingship. So there's a very, very strong possibility. And this is new thinking, which I'm sure is going to be developed as the years go by. And again, something you can all be working on. Okay, why do we think it could have been St. Augustine's? Again, the monks. This was the center of manuscript production, and the style of the Bayeux Tapestry was taken from manuscript illustration. It was a new spangled style at that time to have a block of color surrounded by an outline of something else. And so we've done that just as they did in the Bayeux Tapestry. So that's one reason why you would think that it could have been St. Augustine's. They had skilled artists because of their manuscript production. Odo was an extremely generous benefactor of St. Augustine's. So the fact that he is promoted in the tapestry would be only natural because they're trying to flatter this man, perhaps so that he'll be even more generous. Vital and Woodard are 2 men who were insignificant in their role in royal politics, but who are named in the tapestry. I think it's only 15 men who are named. And most of them are William, his 2 brothers, Harold, Edward, etc. These 2, people can't even absolutely identify. But they were 2 people who were, in effect, servants of St. Augustine's, and for whom the monks were to pray in perpetuity. So they may, that may be the reason why they were there. Vital was known for having brought a ship full of that Caen stone over safely when every other ship that was taking stone to Westminster sank. So that may be another reason for believing that it could have been St. Augustine's. and especially because they had a deeper knowledge of fables than most people would have. And I think the tapestry is full of fables that are only just being uncovered. Now, how did we do ours? First of all, the inspiration. I found this book on how the Bayeux Tapestry would have been made. This is telling the story of the embroiderers. It also tells the story of how you would go about making a tapestry at that time. And I loved it. Having read it, thought about it for a while, I thought, well, we could make one of those as a community project. And so the idea came from here. We had permission from Jan Messent to use some of her ideas, and so you will see that we did. Now, the instruction to Pauline was, it must look like the Bayeux Tapestry, it must fit into the assumed dimensions of the missing link, and the colors will have to be the same, the style will have to be the same, and this is the miracle she came up with. If you made a tapestry back in the olden days, there was no paper. You would start with a little tablet of wood with wax in it, and you would sketch out with a stylus of some sort what you thought. And if your patron liked it, that would be fine. Then you would trace it onto parchment. If he didn't like it, you'd have to melt the wax and start again. That's not an easy process. From the parchment, they would have put it onto linen and pricked the linen. Now this is a method that is still used in embroidery today. Then you stamp it with powdered charcoal, which will create little dots where you pricked the parchment. Once that's done, you have to trace a line so that with some kind of paint or ink so that you can see it more clearly. Some of this we had to do. We had paper, pens, and such, but we still had to do the tracing, just as they would have had to. It's 4 tracings from when you had the actual sketch finished until you had something you could work with, so we got to know it. But of course, they had to do it with light from candles and fires. Imagine working on something the length of the Bayeux Tapestry where you have fire around you all the time. They had straw on the floors in many instances. We don't know that they had straw where they did this, but since straw was a normal floor covering, imagine the fire on the floor when you're stitching on a tapestry. We, of course, had our electric lights. They had small windows because they didn't have glass yet. So oiled linen or horn, not much light is going to get through, hence all the fires. I suspect it was only done during the summer when the light was good. Maybe they even did it outside. We can't know, but it takes good light to be able to do good embroidery. They had hand-woven fabric, well, ours is machine-made. But other than that, there's not too much difference. The needles they had, somebody asked me about this today. The needles they had were every bit as good as ours. But where we can go down and buy a packet for very little money, theirs were extremely precious, and they would have guarded all their tools with care, because if you lost your needle, you weren't going to be able to continue until you had carved out another. They were made from horn, for the most part, or bone. Okay, when we started out, you can see we have a happy atmosphere here. People sitting around this frame, just as they would have had then. But our frame could tip, so that as we had to work with the threads underneath, we could tip it up and see what was under there. They probably didn't have that. We had young people and we had older people. This man who was stitching was so proud because he's from an old Alderney family. And he said, I really want to stitch William's name. He said, I'm so proud of William. So I said, okay. And he stitched it. He did just about all of William. And I think it was a source of great pride for him. He's now suffering from Alzheimer's, so I hope he remembers it. And we had some well-known people stitching. They had great fun. I mean, no plaque to unveil, no tree to they could stitch. And they really enjoyed it. And then we got to the completion of it, January 2013, and the unveiling. This was a moment of terror because I knew that no other Tapestry Finale had ever been accepted at the Bayeux Tapestry Museum. And the lady on the left, right, is the curator of the Bayeux Tapestry. The man on the left was the Président du Conseil de la Manche. La Manche is the province of France that's closest to us, and he was very interested in promoting closer links between the Channel Islands and France. He was a former minister, so he was a powerful man, and so when he said to the curator, "I think you should come," she came. Thank heavens, but we were in terror. What on earth was she going to say? She pulled back the curtain, and she said, "Oh, c'est excellent." Oh. And then we went to Bayeux. We were invited on that day of the unveiling to have our tapestry in the Bayeux Tapestry Museum. Again, the first time ever. It was seen by over 141,000 people during that summer. We were happy. Okay, why did we do it? Well, here's that logo again. Because if it weren't for what happened in 1066, the Channel Islands would not be British crown dependencies. And we're very happy about that. And that is our lovely little island. So please come and see it. I have something I wanted to read to you, because why should you not end a talk with an introduction? This is an introduction that was, I've abridged it, written by Harriet Harvey Wood. Very few battles change history. The claim has been made for the Battle of Waterloo, but Waterloo merely confirmed the course of a history that was clearly visible before it, but it had been rudely interrupted by Napoleon's re-entry on the European stage. It marked a turning point. It was not a catalyst. The Battle of Britain is perhaps a stronger contender, or the Battle of Lepanto. William Golding has, with some justice, claimed the distinction for Thermopylae on the grounds that it won 30 years of respite, enabling Athens to develop from a small provincial town to the city of Pericles that was to dominate the Mediterranean for centuries. John Stuart Mill claimed a similar distinction for the Battle of Marathon, adding that it was more significant than the Battle of Hastings, even as an event in English history, since it changed the whole basis of Western civilization. It is perhaps impossible to make a comparable claim for the significance of the Battle of Hastings, but it cannot be denied that it too was a battle that was to change the face of Europe and cause a fundamental realignment between its major players. It was one of the rare battles that have decided the fate of nations. Crécy, Agincourt, Magna Carta, and much more lay implicit in the early morning mist that hung over Caldbeck Hill on 14 October 1066. But whatever the consequences of the battle, one fact is undisputed. It wiped out overnight a civilization that, for its wealth, its political arrangements, its arts, its literature, and its longevity, was unique in Dark Age Europe and deserves celebration. In the general instability, lawlessness, and savagery of the times, Anglo-Saxon England stood out as a beacon. And I would think in this society you are some of the great appreciators of that which the Anglo-Saxons had created. But, thank you.